There's a forgotten villain in America's industrial history, one that poisoned the air, the soil, and generations of children. It wasn't a nuclear weapon, not a chemical spill. It was something far more common: gasoline. For nearly a century, America knowingly pumped leaded gasoline into every car, every neighborhood, every pair of young lungs. This is the story of how one of the most dangerous innovations in U.S. history was marketed as a miracle, and how the truth was buried under billions of dollars. The year was 1921. At General Motors Research Lab, chemist Thomas Migley Jr. was searching for a way to eliminate a pesky problem: engine knocking. Engines at the time were noisy, inefficient, and temperamental. Car manufacturers desperately needed a fix. Migley's solution? A compound called tetraethyl lead. It worked like magic. Add just a few grams to gasoline and engines purred like never before. By 1923, GM partnered with Standard Oil and DuPont to form a new company, the Ethyl Corporation. Their goal? Mass produce and sell this miracle additive to every corner of America. But from the very beginning, there were warnings. Researchers and factory workers exposed to tetraethyl lead began showing alarming symptoms: hallucinations, seizures, and even death. At a Standard Oil plant in New Jersey, 5 workers died within a year. When reporters asked Migley about it, he downplayed the risk, claiming people just weren't using it correctly. To prove it was safe, Migley famously washed his hands in tetraethyl lead and inhaled its vapors at a press event. What the cameras didn't show was Migley quietly retreating weeks later, suffering from severe lead poisoning. Despite the early signs, the Ethyl Corporation pushed forward. The profits were simply too high. By the 1930s, leaded gasoline was everywhere. It powered America's booming car culture and wartime economy. Big oil and auto manufacturers had no intention of slowing down. Public health officials raised red flags, warning of airborne lead accumulating in cities and children's bodies. But the industry had already learned how to play defense. They funded their own research, published biased studies, and discredited independent scientists. One of the loudest critics was Dr. Alice Hamilton, a Harvard physician and early pioneer in toxicology. She called tetraethyl lead a creeping and sinister poison. But her warnings fell on deaf ears, especially in Washington. Government regulators largely sided with industry, citing insufficient evidence of harm. Meanwhile, lead from gasoline was saturating the air. Every time a car started, microscopic particles of lead were released into the atmosphere. It stuck to buildings, coated playgrounds, and settled into the lungs of millions. Children were especially vulnerable. Lead exposure in early development leads to permanent IQ loss, behavioral issues, and neurological damage. In city after city, blood tests revealed alarming results, but few listened. By the 1950s, America was burning over 200,000 tons of lead into the atmosphere every year. And the auto industry kept telling consumers that lead was perfectly safe. TV ads and billboards praised leaded gas as high-performance fuel. The truth was hidden behind layers of marketing, money, and willful ignorance. By the 1960s, the damage was becoming impossible to ignore. Children in inner cities were showing signs of widespread lead poisoning. Some neighborhoods had rates so high they resembled lead smelter zones. While developing radiometric dating techniques, Patterson was baffled by the extreme levels of lead contamination in air, ice, and even human bones. He traced the source not to natural background levels, but to industrial pollution, especially from gasoline. In 1965, Patterson published a bombshell study showing how artificial lead levels had risen 1,000-fold since ancient times. His findings suggested the public was being exposed to dangerous amounts of lead from gasoline, and the consequences were global. The oil and auto industries attacked his credibility. He was denied research funding. Even access to some labs was revoked. Despite the pressure, Patterson doubled down. He campaigned for unleaded fuel and stricter environmental controls. Meanwhile, more studies emerged linking lead exposure to developmental problems, crime rates, and cognitive decline. It became clear leaded gasoline was poisoning entire generations, especially in poor and minority communities. Yet, by 1970, nearly every car in America still ran on leaded gas. The fight to remove it was just beginning, and it would take a battle against both science denial and billion-dollar interests. In 1970, the United States created the Environmental Protection Agency, partially in response to rising public concern over pollution. The EPA quickly identified lead as a major health hazard and proposed phasing it out of gasoline. Industry giants like GM, Standard Oil, and Ethyl Corp pushed back hard. They claimed removing lead would destroy engines, raise fuel prices, and cripple the economy. Their lobbyists flooded Washington, delaying action for years. Meanwhile, scientists like Dr. Herbert Needleman were gathering new data, this time from the classroom. Needleman's groundbreaking research showed that even low levels of lead exposure were lowering children's IQ scores and increasing behavioral problems. These were not rare cases. They were nationwide. Facing mounting evidence and public pressure, the EPA finally passed regulations in 1973 requiring a gradual reduction in leaded gasoline. But it was a slow fight. Their lobbyists flooded Washington, delaying action for years. Despite resistance, by the late 1970s, automakers were building engines that ran on unleaded gas. In 1986, the U.S. government finally banned leaded fuel for use in on-road vehicles. Blood lead levels in children dropped by more than 80% over the next decade. Crime rates, learning disabilities, and public health metrics all began to shift in measurable ways. But the damage had already been done to millions, and the corporations responsible never truly paid. The era of leaded gasoline might be over in America, but its consequences still linger. Millions of children were affected by decades of exposure, some now adults unknowingly carrying the scars of a silent poison. Studies continue to find correlations between lead exposure and lower lifetime earnings, increased aggression, and even higher incarceration rates. In 1970, the United States created the Environmental Protection Agency, partially in response to rising public concern over pollution. It wasn't just a public health disaster, it was an environmental injustice. And what about accountability? Industry giants like GM, Standard Oil, and Ethyl Corp pushed back hard. No major executive was ever held legally responsible. Even worse, these same companies exported leaded gasoline to developing countries for years after the U.S. ban. While Americans were told lead was too dangerous at home, corporations sold it abroad, where regulations were weaker and voices easier to silence. In 1970, the United States created the Environmental Protection Agency, partially in response to rising public concern over pollution. That's a century after Thomas Midgley's first chemical experiment. And tragically, Midgley himself would become a symbol of innovation gone wrong. He didn't just invent leaded gasoline. He also developed CFCs, the chemicals that destroyed the ozone layer. Two of the most environmentally destructive inventions in history, by the same man. Today, the story of leaded gasoline remains a warning. Innovation without ethics can be lethal. It shows how corporate profits, scientific denial, and government inaction can combine into a slow-moving catastrophe. The EPA quickly identified lead as a major health hazard and proposed phasing it out of gasoline. The lead is gone from our gas tanks, but is it still in our systems, our policies, our playbook for progress? This is not just a tale of the past, it's a question for our future.